Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now before modern Ryzen and Athlon APUs we had chips like this. The A8 6600K here is a socket FM2 based Richland APU from AMD, and as short-lived as it seems that socket was, the price of these CPUs is still quite high. I mean, they cost more used than a new Athlon 3000G in some instances, so that must mean that they're better, right? Well, with 2 modules, 4 CPU cores and integrated 8570D graphics, it would have offered up acceptable performance at lower resolutions back in its day, but nowadays, well, we're going to have to see. FM2 socket motherboards supported Trinity and Richland APUs that released between October 2012 and June of 2013, though these processors could still be used with the soon-to-follow FM2 Plus boards of the time. The 6600K is a 100 watt CPU with a clock speed of 3.9 GHz and a turbo of 4.2, but like a lot of APUs, it's the onboard graphics that hold it back. The onboard graphics are all we have for today's video, but later in the week I'll be seeing how the CPU does in comparison to something it probably shouldn't be compared to, but with a discrete graphics card in our system. That will have to wait for now though. But let's get into what the AMD A8 6600K is capable of in 2020 and talk about the limitations that I ran into when using this thing, aside of course from the onboard graphics. So the first thing to do was actually work out whereabouts this CPU placed in Cinebench R20. Of course, I was curious just to see how well it would do in this CPU rendering test because, to be honest, well, I thought it would suffer. And as it turns out, it sat close to the i3 4130. In fact, if you turn hyperthreading off with the i3 4130, then this 6600K will actually outperform it. So yeah, it did better than I thought right off the bat. As I said before, the CPU isn't really the problem here, it's the integrated GPU. That being said, I think this CPU and its integrated graphics will probably do better than the i3 with its integrated graphics, but you never know, maybe that will be a test that we check out at some point. Now, I must apologise to my teammates here in Apex Legends. I suffered a power cut briefly when running this game, so everything went down, including the internet. I did manage to run a couple of minutes of benchmarking, but yeah, it was a bit of a disaster. Not just the loss of power, but the whole test itself. We were averaging around 20 frames per second at 720p with the lowest settings. However, there are some moments in the game when you will see 30, namely in indoor areas. If you want to achieve 30 all of the time, well, unfortunately, you'll probably have to do something like this. Or this. So not ideal by any means. Now I think would be a good time to mention games that didn't run. Red Dead Redemption 2 was one of them. It kept giving us a GFX error and told us to either restart or reinstall the drivers, but of course none of these things helped. I even installed an older version of the driver. Now this does run off older drivers, so of course that could be the problem here. But another couple of games that didn't work were Call of Duty Warzone, as well as the remastered version of Crysis. That being said, however, the original version of Crysis will run really well at 720p with the high settings if you're happy with a 30 FPS target. Now you could probably turn things down to medium or low and get a bit more, but the game looks pretty bad at those settings. Well, low anyway. High gives you a nice balance between graphical fidelity and performance, I feel, though of course if you aren't happy with 30 and you'd rather 60, then yeah, you're going to need to reduce pretty much everything, maybe even the resolution a little bit more too. Crysis, the original version, still looks pretty good in my opinion, and if you have a PC that can't quite handle the remastered release, well, it's always worth playing the OG version. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Grand Theft Auto 5 looks a little bit choppy on this setup, it looks a little bit laggy here and there, and you'd be correct. Once again, the CPU has a little more to give, but the HD 8570D iGPU is holding us back here. Of course, there are a few moments whereby the CPU does start to limit the GPU. Performance was honestly a little bit all over the place, but you can expect 30 plus FPS in terms of the average figure, though the 1% low will suffer quite a bit. I think we were seeing about 11, but of course I'll have the exact figures up on the screen for you. Now, I was also driving around the more sparsely populated area of the map, so places like downtown Los Santos might really suffer with this hardware. Now, I must apologise to my hostage here. I played through a bit of Rainbow Six Siege. This was a lone wolf practice session, so there weren't any other players on screen aside from, of course, the enemy. However, performance did a lot better than I thought. Once again, the HD 8570D graphics were maxing out at pretty much 97 to 99 or even 100% a lot of the time. The CPU usage sat at about 60 to 70 a lot of the time, and at 720p with the lowest settings we were able to see at least 30 FPS, which was a nice surprise, to be honest. I didn't expect this game to run on this APU, but it is doable. Just bear in mind that your online experience may differ, and when I say may, well, it probably will. Let's just wait a second here for the enemy to show up to see how this affects the frame rate. So let's just run up these stairs here. Right, they found the hostage, so I'm pretty much failing at this, as always. Right, as you can see, the frame rate still stays above 30 FPS, just about. Dips down to 30 exactly there. 30, 31 most of the time, and that's pretty much it. So another game I've been getting back into recently has been The Crew 2, the successor to The Crew. This takes place in a pretty much open world reimagining of the United States. I think it's really fun. As you can see, I'm trying to race my Ferrari through downtown Miami here, but we're seeing about 10 to 15 frames per second. Racing anyone else doesn't really work out too well because, yeah, they've probably got much higher frame rates than I do. This was pretty much unplayable. The motion blur was terrible. I don't think there's a way to turn this off. I pretty much turned everything down to low at 720p and ended up through the front door of this building. So yeah, it's not a brilliant experience by any means. Let's just turn around here and see if we can get that frame rate a little bit higher. No, you're pretty much going to be limited to 10, 15 frames per second most of the time, but it depends where you are on the map. What I can say for sure is that you're not going to see 30. So let's finalise with CSGO. Now you're going to be seeing at least 30 frames per second here at 720p with the lowest settings and anti-aliasing turned off. The game will hit 60 FPS on occasion, although plus 30 is the best you can really expect. I think the APU does okay in some games, but for the price that it can still be found for, well, it's certainly not worth buying, especially when you consider the Athlon 3000G, for example, which costs about £30 or £40, I think, here in the UK at the moment, and does a better job. Now, this may be good for anyone who wants something for basic computing if they can find one cheap enough, but when it comes to gaming, I suppose it could tide you over for a couple of days while you're waiting for a new GPU, if all you play is CSGO, for example, maybe a bit of Rainbow Six Siege. But I hope you've enjoyed the look back at this A8 6600K today. If you did, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know if you use one of these and, of course, what you think of it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.